Hello, I'm Duncan Fraser, Director of Useful and Kind Unlimited, a charity which aims to develop pro-social behaviour and leadership, especially with young people. Welcome to our podcast series, which aims to explore how being useful and kind to yourself, to others, and to the world can make things better. Today, our theme lies at the very heart of what we're trying to do, namely, develop young leaders, and how being useful and kind can really help us, others, and the world to be more balanced and to cope with the huge issues that we all face. As many of you know, our organization is based on the words of advice Barack Obama gives to his daughters and to interns and young leaders, namely, to be useful and kind. So we're thrilled and honored to be joined today by both the Chief Exec of the Obama Foundation and by one of its first British Fellows. David Seamuth is the Chief Exec of the Obama Foundation and knew early on why being a change maker was important, as we shall hear in due course. For him, this was initially in the law, and after a significant career in law and politics, he ended up at the heart of one of the most inspirational administrations in American history, as Deputy Assistant to President Obama. Welcome, David.
Duncan, it's such a great joy and a pleasure to be with you, and congratulations to you and to the rest of the team for doing the work that you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Alex Smith is the founder and chief exec of the CARES family, which helps people find connection and community in a disconnected age. And this was started when he noticed, whilst out canvassing, the great need for individual and collective connections. Alex is also no stranger to the world of politics, as he was formerly an advisor to Ed Miliband when he was leader of the British Labour Party. In 2018, Alex was appointed one of 20 inaugural Obama Foundation Fellows, selected from 21,000 applicants from around the world. And in 2019, he also became an Encore Public Voices Fellow in recognition of his work on generational unity. Welcome, Alex.
Duncan, hi. Thank you for having me. Looking forward to this.
Wonderful. David and Alex are pro-social leaders in their field, not just in their jobs, but in the way they model pro-social leadership and the way they lead our lives. Thank you both so much for joining us today. So I wondered if we might kick off with, when did you first realize that you could make such a big difference? What was the early trigger for you? David?
Duncan, I don't know about the qualifier of big difference. It was generally a matter of, I think, the reinforcement from my parents, who were both immigrants to the United States from Portugal. They had grown up in the Salazar regime, and like tens of millions of other people, left everything behind to start a new life in a place where they had no connection. The emphasis by my parents consistently on both individuality, anchored around a sense of respect and dignity, which was always articulated as respect for yourself and for others. It was never separated, ever. There were no kind of profound statements about that, but implicit in that was, moving away from the duality, or the sense that if I simply act, if I simply do what I want to do, then I've cordoned off whatever ramifications. And the way my dad would explain it is, and I remember this as a little boy, 5, 6, 7 years old. When you act, when you speak, it not only has an effect on you, but the way people think about you, the way people think about me and your mother, the way people think about our family, the way people think about our Portuguese immigrant community. And so respect, in Portuguese, respeito. So rather than, Duncan, a kind of a seminal or a significant effect or note of change maker. I think that was a very important and early lesson about the smallest things, literally the smallest things. He would, in a rather doctrinaire kind of severe Portuguese way, tuck in your shirt. Well, I don't want to tuck in my shirt. Well, here, fairly or unfairly, are way people are going to perceive. And it was that notion, I think, of not just being an automaton, not being an island, but as being someone who could influence change. And then just quickly, the first taste that I had of people coming together to affect change, I think I was 7 or 8 when I volunteered on my first political campaign. And I mean, right, you're a child, but the buzz around just stuffing the envelope and seeing people coming together around a person or an idea or a cause was one of the most exhilarating things. And I remember vividly that, if you want to change the world, and that was too big and grandiose, but if I want to make my community a little bit better, this is the way, one of the ways that you're able to do that. And so both a personal and a communitarian view.
How wonderful. So your dad basically was our model of self, others, and world. It was live it, show it, model it in every day. And there's another lovely connection, David. We have a young trustee on our board who's Portuguese, who came to the UK when he was 12 with not a word of English. Yeah. 4 years later, he was head boy. He was one of the stars of our first summer school and is now just about to get a placement at the Bank of England.
Extraordinary.
So he also feels that sense of self and representation. Fantastic. Alex, what about for you? When did you first realize you could make a big difference? What was the trigger?
Well, I think it's a journey. I think it's something I'm very much still learning about and trying to bring other people with me on that journey. But if I reflect all the way back to my childhood, there were some things which, in retrospect, I've become conscious about later, which were absolutely foundations for some of my philosophy and what I believe about the agency in community. Firstly, I think I'm born and raised in a place called Camden Town in London, which some people will know is a dynamic, vibrant, inner city, diverse place, always thriving, the centre of British music, and in my opinion, therefore, probably the centre of world music. People coming and going all the time. But what it had, in spite of that kind of transience and pace, was this real genuine sense of community and people knowing one another. And I'm not being nostalgic about this. These are genuine memories. And I don't think things are better in the past necessarily by any stretch of the imagination. But there was a sense that people in communities knew one another and they knocked on one another's doors. And, I remember my best friend, who's still one of my best friends now, which tells you something about the meaning of community as a child as well. I think the longevity of that community. But, he once walked along my street and put his hand in the front door that my dad was painting. And my dad, you couldn't do this now, but my dad gave him an admonishing clip around the ear. But that was the love of community sometimes came in its harsher lessons. And it was a knowing, friendly, jovial, supportive, loving clip around the ear. It was a learning admonishment. But so Camden was this place that was both thriving, vibrant, dynamic, diverse, but also had this sense of rootedness. And even though there were people from all over the world, it felt to me like people knew one another. And my best memory of that time, my favorite memory of that time, is not of the council or, city government or national government doing things to make change in our community. It was of the people doing things to make change, whether that was a local community fair or a local school fair or very vividly, I have the memory of people on our street planting trees one summer's evening. You know, there were beers going around and people had their front doors open. So Camden was part of it, but also on the other hand, my mum comes from a place which is a tiny, tiny village in very rural northeastern Lincolnshire, close to Grimsby. And that had a very different sense of civic agency, but a very clear sense of civic agency nonetheless, where again, people came together and would organize their own post office because there wasn't one in the local community. And they would organize their own church services. And I saw that faith groups could very much be about the spirit and the agency within community too. And I think those messages were reinforced as I was growing up. So my mum would always say, when I was an individual and rambunctious young boy, you must think of others. You must be considerate of others. It's the echo I can hear in my mind most frequently from childhood. You must think of others. You must be more considerate. And then the other thing I think is at school, my school, which was a very ordinary comprehensive school in Camden, its motto was rather use than fame. And that stuck with me. And it was drilled into us. Lots of the people who I went to school with are very civic, very communitarian, quite entrepreneurial in how they do their community. And, you know, we had a schoolboy sense of wit. So sometimes it was changed in graffiti to rather you than me, with some of the letters blocked over. But so anyway, you know, Camden being a very civic place, I think was something that instilled a sense of community and a sense of agency in me from an early age.
So for both of you, a sense of balance between the individual change that you can make, the role you play, but also how there's a greater sense of agency and traction if we work together. Given we focus at Useful and Kind on this balance between ourselves, and I know the Obama Foundation does too, on really understanding who we are, where we've come from, what our values are, what informed that, is it healthy and helpful? One of, I think, the important things, I'd be really interested to know what you feel, is the ability to be able to reflect on what's gone well. So I just wonder if you could say what you think has been your personal greatest achievement. So it could be something that you didn't think you could actually achieve, or it could be something that's had a huge impact. Alex.
Well, I can't answer that question without giving a nod to my two new baby twins, who you may be able to hear on this call. I don't think anyone who is a parent would say that anything else would, you know, kind of supersede that in terms of personal achievements. And they're beautiful and wonderful, and sorry if they're being noisy right now. They've just had their first jabs. I would say that there is a moment which, you know, the CARES family, the organization that I set up and run, has a very famous founding story of how I encountered an 84-year-old man, as you mentioned at the top, Duncan, canvassing as a naive young wannabe politician in my own community, thinking that was the only way to make change. And the relationship that I garnered and developed with him taught me about my own sense of isolation that I had been experiencing by virtue of, you know, commuting to work, hanging out with other people who were just like me, having my headphones in my ears all day, spending time with other people who were like me at weddings, you know, during evenings and weekends. And that relationship that I had with Fred inspired what became the CARES family, where now 25,000 and 30,000 older and younger people have come together to form similar beautiful friendships. But that's not the moment I would choose. The moment I would choose would be almost 10 years ago now to the day, August the 8th, 2011. Was the day that we launched the first part of the CARES family, North London Cares, in my community, that place that I'd been rooted in my whole life. And there was rioting going on in London. Duncan, you may remember, huge social riots. And it was happening in my community. And we hadn't yet created what was then North London Cares. We didn't have a plan. We didn't have a trustee board. I didn't have any money. I had no idea how to make change in the world, frankly, even though I'd been involved in campaigns and politics. But what I decided to do, with the encouragement of some people in my community who knew that I had this intention of setting up the CARES family, was spontaneously to see what was happening on our streets: fires, looting, rioting, discontent, violence that had been going on for days, and use the internet to encourage and mobilize young people from those communities to stand up and say, this is not what Young London is all about. We can be a civic place. You know, we can be a positive place where we bring value. We can build. We don't need to destroy. In spite of the obvious injustices in the world, the way to overturn those injustices is to do something positive and add value. And during the course of that evening, when we launched that website spontaneously, we signed up, 100 odd people to go out onto the streets with broomsticks and to build relationships where they would take cups of tea to people tidying up in their communities. That movement outgrew us. It became something that was celebrated as the kind of counter narrative to the riots, which was an awful moment in recent British social history. And it created this sense of positivity. And it also, by the way, gave us a platform by which I felt a sense of huge responsibility to need to do something with that moment, because I felt that we hadn't earned that reputation. We hadn't led that movement per se. It had been much more splintered just than, one person or a small group of people trying to encourage others to do things. And it was that sense of responsibility, I think, that then drove me to work and work and work and bring other people on board and trust them with their own agency. To go away and drive the building of the Cares family. So it was that moment in 2011, I think, for me.
Amazing. And it was a huge national moment. And until now, I had no idea that was you. Thank you. David, what about...
I should say, by the way, Duncan, it really wasn't just me or us. That thing inspired many, many other people, and the movement absolutely outgrew us, but we were a small part of it.
I'm sure you were a very important part. David, what about you and achievements?
Duncan, before I dig into achievements, I want to reflect a bit, if you'd permit me, on what Alex just said, especially the line about building rather than destroying. And then the next line about the recognition of the social upheaval in many of the challenges for which the destruction was an antisocial expression. And so even if the underlying genesis is rooted in a sense of valid aggrievement or calling out something that's fundamentally wrong that should be changed, the anchoring back to the choice at that moment to say, look, we can hold these two things in tension. We can call out the injustice that is occurring and occurs around us, while at the same time then say, we organize ourselves in a way to create the space for people from disparate backgrounds and ideas and perspectives to come together in a way to transcend this, but at the same time, the process and the act, which is at the core for me of notions of democracy, is less than the outcome of a policy fight or a legislation or an election, but literally the mundane and routine and normative actions of, okay, I want to hear from you, you're going to hear from me, and now can we build something that may not be perfect, but makes things a little bit better. That choice that Alex and many others made, because it's easy, right? It's easy to be swept up, regardless of your political perspective or ideological orientation, to say there is something fundamentally wrong with the world, and I will do X, Y, or Z. That is a reaction and not a reflection. And in some instances, what you have done is you have ceded your agency, you have ceded your sense of responsibility to the entire situation, to the entire context around you. You're not exhibiting any sense of either personal or communitarian leadership. By contrast, what Alex just described, which goes to the heart of useful and good, for me at least, is that sense of, okay, I have a choice. in this moment, notwithstanding all of these other plans that I have, what am I called upon to do in a way that is consistent with my values? How can I be both useful and good, not in a naive kind of idealistic kind of way, but in that sense of, you know, how can I help others? And that anecdote is just a powerful example, I think, Duncan and Alex, of, you know, all of those individual choices that, whether you call a leader in government, or for me at least, that very sense of, before I can presume to lead others, ever, have I so, not perfectly, but do I have a good sense of what leadership of self means? And leadership of self in that instant that Alex just described. Okay, what do I do, right?
And I'm not going to let you dodge, humility aside, your own reflection on your greatest achievement, David.
Yeah. The movement or the activity that I am most proud of, and there are many that I'm less proud of, where ego, vanity, and pride superseded, the constant enemies of leadership. I was working for the governor of Massachusetts, a man named Deval Patrick, and this is 2007. And there was an item before the Massachusetts General Court, and that is the state legislature. And once every 2 years, the General Court, the House of Representatives and the Senate, comes together and sits in constitutional convention. I mean, it's we can learn a thing or two from the pomp of English democracy, and obviously Massachusetts has tried to learn a thing or two about it. But essentially, it's the great and general court sitting in constitutional convention. It's a big deal. And the question was, should the legislature put a referendum on the ballot for popular review around marriage equality? Now, what had happened was, a few years before, the state Supreme Court had legalized same-sex marriage. John Adams, in a couple of hundred years ago, in drafting the Massachusetts Constitution, put in a provision, I believe, that said that before any item went to the populace, it had to be reviewed by 2 successive legislatures. And the beautiful piece of that was tamping down the intensity or the populism of a moment, to let the moment pass, and then to be considered reflection rather than reaction. And so essentially my challenge, along with the rest of the team, was, could we convince enough members of the legislature not to put the question on the ballot and let the Supreme Court ruling stand? And I will never forget this, Duncan and Alex, as long as I live. The governor was a man named Deval Patrick, an African-American, only the second in the country who had been elected governor, and this is before Barack Obama elected president, calling in member after member of the House of Representatives and the Senate who were against marriage equality and wanted to put it on the ballot because I think they understood that it would be overturned. And engaging in the most powerful and empathetic discussions, where he would say to an Irish American legislator, he would give his story about being a young African American growing up on the south side of Chicago and what he faced, in eliciting from them stories about Irish need not apply and the stories that their families would tell them. He would do the same thing with the Italian American legislators, and the same thing with the Polish American legislators, and the same thing with the Hispanic American legislators, because everyone had a story of being the other. And at that moment where they were sharing those stories of empathy, he would then introduce, well, how are our gay and lesbian brothers and sisters any different? And being one small part of that, and then seeing it culminating where the vote came up in the Constitutional Convention, and it didn't pass to put it on the ballot. And then we look out the window onto Boston Common, and there are a couple of thousand people there with American flags and rainbow flags, talking about how the process of democracy had validated something as powerful as two people who love each other to be married. But the backstory is something that I am so proud of being a small part of. And,
what a fantastic example of something that we talk about, David and Alex, which is in the others bit of our model, is that how it's relatively easy to be useful and kind to those you love, or it was before lockdown. It's quite hard to be useful and kind to those who aren't useful and kind. We've done a lot of thinking about that's where real change will happen. And for me personally, it's about exactly what you talk about. It's about empathy, love, having a respect and celebration of the other, not being against them. Not a wholly popular view at the moment, I could share with you.
But Duncan, you know, I think there's something that is really implicit in what David and I are both talking about here, but we've not yet had the opportunity to make explicit, which is the power of story. And David, I want to remember to ask you a question at the end of this, but I'll start by sharing something that I learned as an Obama Fellow, which is this concept of the 200-year present. And it's interesting that David and I, with your invitation, Duncan, both started this podcast by really speaking about our own heritage, our own parents and grandparents. And then David just talked about Massachusetts and you know, a 200-year history in that state. And the 200-year present that we learned about was to think of the oldest person you know, who is alive right now, who you have a relationship with, and to think of the youngest person that you know, who is also alive right now and you have a relationship. In my case, that could be any one of the 100-odd-year-olds that we work with in the Cares family. I'm fortunate to know many people from that generation. And well, I have 8-week-old twins in the next room. And if I think about those two lifespans, which overlap, yeah, I can think about the acceleration and the possibility of change during the course of what feels like a huge span of time, but in reality is two lifespans. So just to think about the change that's gone on in this world during the last 200 years and the change that we are all capable of in the next 200. And it comes back to this notion of story, how we connect to our heritage. We need to know our roots. We need to share those stories in order to lift up empathy. And I suppose my question, David, is you talked about times of cynicism, or you talked in effect about cynicism and how difficult it can be to reach for compassion and reach for empathy. And Duncan, you've mentioned this too, particularly when maybe people around you or the world around you is not being particularly kind, particularly to people that it chooses to marginalize. Let's be honest about that. And so, David, I wonder if you have any tips or tools from converting what I know you have called in the past in other conversations we've had together, compassion, which is about feeling somebody else's pain or injustice, to empathy, which is about seeking to take action to do something about it and overcoming that cynicism in order to take those actions.
Alex, first of all, thank you for the reminder of the 200-year story. It's so vivid and beautiful. And as I just saw the gleam in your eye as you talked about your twins, and even the way you talked about the greatest achievement, because I've got a 22-year-old and a 15-year-old. And my 22-year-old who just graduated from college is now in the process of, her words, not mine, learning how to adult. And constantly coming back to things that I didn't even realize she was listening to or watching, that my wife and I would tell her, that these acts of the transmission of values and heritage and story from a parent to a child, which is the family unit, in my estimation, is the most important unit in society because of that, the transmission of story and values. And so I will try to answer the question with another story from Barack Obama. In southern Illinois, Alex and Duncan, it's essentially on the Kentucky and Missouri border, which is a very different place culturally. It's the South. And in walks a very skinny African-American man named Barack Hussein Obama into a Veterans of Foreign Wars hall, where there are 70 and 80-year-old men playing cards, looking askance at this guy. He says, because he was running for United States Senate, well, what do? The first thing you do is you look for the friendliest face, and that's kind of grading it on a curve. And once he sees that person, this man in this instance, he walks up to him and he says, "My name is Barack Obama. Thank you for your service, sir." All of a sudden, the man, didn't burst into a smile, but his facial expression is very, very different. And he said, "Well, thank you." Obama then, in a very genuine way, said, "I remember my grandfather, who was a veteran in Patton's Third Army, talking about the Battle of the Bulge and the sacrifices that his brothers in arms made in defense of freedom and democracy. And so I am just grateful to you and anyone who does this." Alex and Duncan, every single person in that room, whether they voted for him or agreed with him or not, all of a sudden it created this opening that then allowed him to begin the act of maybe not persuasion, but developing the connection that can then allow those men to put down the defense mechanisms for a little bit and to engage in an actual and genuine conversation. And so the underlying ethos or the philosophy there that I think goes to the heart of what you're trying to create, Doug, especially with people who hate you. Can you enter into the conversation with at least an assumption or a generosity of spirit that does not presume that you actually know their heart or their intentions? Now, some people can show you, and once they showed you who they are, based upon their actions to you, and it's clear, and principle is what principle is. But even then, I go back to, Alex, the anecdote you gave about the riots. Now you have a choice. How do you engage with that person or people who you assume are like you? Now, the struggle for me when you think about a broader societal approach to that is, how do you begin to take these individual actions akin to the Obama story that I just told, or how the three of us may or may not act with people who disagree with us, and create an entire societal and cultural series of norms around that is the expectation when there's so much around us in our politics, in our business, in our religion, that works against that very kind of basic empathy to compassion strain, where empathy is the heart of I feel you, compassion is, well, I want to do something about it. And so that's the piece that I struggle with. And then the final thing I'll say is this is where, at least in terms of the work of the Obama Foundation, institutions are so critical. The anecdote or the metaphor on a marketplace of ideas does not work unless there are a series of institutions where those ideas can be transacted around a set of expectations and norms about how we will engage and relate to one another. So can we and others like us create institutions where it isn't just a one-off, but thousands of Alex Smiths on a yearly basis throughout the United States and throughout the world, who are steeped in this ethos and these values, can then model that civic leadership in a way that then it becomes the exemplar for action and activity. Duncan, sorry for the long.
No, it's fantastically rich and helpful, David. Thank you. I mean, at Useful and Kind, we use a very similar thing, which is we use the idea of the Iroquois Indian thing about if you're making a decision, what will the impact be 7 generations hence? And I've written a little thing about this, about, you know, we don't even know 3 generations back, never mind what it will be. And I wanted to just add something on that, loving the hater, which is, of course, being a therapist, no one is born like that. And you talk about the importance of family, David. Well, many families aren't such a great place for people to be, and the attachment patterns created when early are disorganized and insecure and so on. And I think part of that, of modeling and showing love where there has been little, is a kind of task that, David, your work, Alex, absolutely your work is about. But I wanted to come back to this notion of time, because for the young leaders that we're working with, given climate change, they have a foreshortened sense of what a future might be. And I'm just wondering what you think and feel about that, and what you think and feel from your experience has been the Greta effect. Alex, would you share with us?
Ooh. I mean, Greta Thunberg is an extraordinary leader. And I think we put a lot of pressure on young people if we say everybody can be Greta Thunberg, because there are unique circumstances. And she, I think, never would have anticipated what had happened by virtue of taking a stand. And so some of these things we should be conscious and name that they can happen by accident as well as by design. But what I would say is that Greta's story shows the power of somebody inspiring other people to use their agency, somebody without qualification, without the type of experience, in inverted commas, that most power structures would value. This is a child, ostensibly was a child at the time when she first stepped up. And I think that really shows the power in individuals recognizing both that we cannot wait for big government or big business or big charities to solve the problems that are right in front of our eyes. And we can all do something about them. And if that is Greta's legacy, I think that's a wonderful thing. What I would just say about young people broadly, there's a new piece of research in the UK, and I think this just applies to people in the UK, young people in the UK, but I think is reflective of some of the kind of operating models and attitudes that are prevalent in younger cultures. And Barack Obama has spoken a little about this as well, actually. And that is that the cohort of kind of 18 to 24-year-olds is the most socially conscious generation in recent history, in known recent history. And there is a huge opportunity in that. And it's because of digital media. It's because of the passage of time in the 200-year present we've already talked about, and how the long art, I've forgotten the quote, so please cut this bit out, but the arc of moral universe is long, tends towards justice, and I think people are starting to recognize that. But while they are the most socially conscious generation in recent history, they are the least socially active in their own neighborhoods, right? And that's just and that tells me that there is a huge disconnect between the desire that people have, like Greta Thunberg, to do good in the world, and their sense of capability within power structures that don't allow people to use that agency. And so what I'd say is we need obviously to find more inclusive, more open, more relatable 21st century institutions. You know, the 20th century institutions were Scouts and Cubs and Girl Guides and trade unions and big state institutions like the National Health Service in this country. We need small, tiny platoons of community-led organizations. And as David says, we need thousands of them. And I just think that what those things hopefully will do will show young people, and young people will feel this sense for themselves that they cannot solve climate injustice and racial or social injustice until and unless they feel a sense of relational injustice. This sense that power is concentrated in small pockets, and therefore powerlessness is also concentrated in small pockets. And until that is dispersed and diffuse and broken up, and agency and power is both spread and recognized as being diffuse, through people knowing their neighbors who are not like them, who have different attitudes to them, who are from different life experiences, different age groups, different ethnicities, different religions, this empathy that we're talking about we need more of in this world will continue to trundle along the bottom until and unless people know others who are not like them. So I would add that relational justice is at least as important as a precursor to climate justice, social justice, and racial justice. I just think that's so fundamental. Knowing other people, being in relationship with other people in particular who are not like you.
So David, given this kind of compression of time, the imminence of catastrophe, the fact that the 18 to 24-year-olds that Alex talked about so passionately have had a really, really tough time in the pandemic, what do you think are the responsibilities for you and the Obama Foundation and for Alex and I in developing young leaders in this context?
It's there are a couple of pieces to this that pivoting off of what Alex just said is right. Not everyone is Greta, but everyone has the capacity to act in some way, rather than calling the local elected official, well, what are you going to do? In order for the person to understand or even think about what they're going to do, they have to have a sense of the basics of not just activism, but organizing. It is insufficient to tweet or to post or even to attend a march or a protest. Those are all necessary and insufficient components on the path to collective change. The best description I ever heard about it was about an energy distribution system, where the activist or the protest and the march essentially is the generation of the energy. But then what happens once the energy is generated? How is it directed via the existing systems and institutions towards the change or series of changes that you want? This is where the transition from activist to organizer occurs, where the organizer can be trained and understand, and this is where we hopefully can fit in, to say, okay, if you care deeply about questions of mass incarceration in the United States, once you finish the protest or the march, now what? Okay, who makes the decisions in your community? It's not the President of the United States. It's not the United States Senate. It's the local district attorney. How is she or he elected? How do they think about their power? What can you do then to bring pressure to bear on them? And so this is essentially the work of civic training towards civic engagement in a way that is about then creating a broader sense of agency and social cohesion. It's both simple and immensely complicated at the same time, but it begins with, that it's, when you talk about some of the basics of community organizing, you have to begin with individual agency first. You have a voice, you have worth, you have power. How do you choose to exercise it around that thing that you care deeply about? But if you stop at individual agency and you don't move to collective action, then you have limited yourself, and you can just tilt at windmills all day and post all the things that you want on social media. And you're not engaged in a generative view of society or even an effective way of making change. And so this comes back to me to the necessity of institutions. There's a wonderful quote by the conservative thinker in the United States, Yuval Levin, who talks about institutions form the individuals who go through them. Now, obviously how you're defining the word form is important, but clearly, once you have effective new forms of institutions for this new era, what is the training? What are the standards? What are the norms? What are the approaches? How do people think about themselves in relation to their peers and others first in the mediated institution, but then when they go out into society in general? And so another thing that Alex alluded to, right, is in an atomized age of social media, where we have more connection than ever, we're more connected than ever, but we feel so little connection with other individuals. The old institutions won't work in an atomized environment. So can you begin to think of each individual person in their Facebook universe of 150 friends and the people who live around them as essentially these institutions of civic exemplars? Because everybody, you can go into any community, whether it's in Camden, there in London, or here on the south side of Chicago, you can walk into a diner and say, okay, who's the person here that is more trusted than anyone else? And usually it's not the elected official or even the business. There's someone over in the corner. Why? Because of the way they are trusted and they have earned trust and they model behavior, not perfectly, but and you can find those people. And my belief is you can train people to be those modern day institutions that are deeply required. It's a final thing that the president says, which is paradoxical and sometimes there's pushback. If you had to choose when to be born at any time in human history, you would choose today. With all of the challenges we have, the world has never been more peaceful, more just, more inclusive, more prosperous. We have existential threats, but it's almost as if we have the tools now to meet the threats, paradoxically, in a way that may be equal to the challenges that we face.
What a wonderful, rich conversation. And given that our organization is based on advice given to children of be useful and kind, I'm wondering, David first, what advice, in a not quite a smaller number of words as Barack did, but what advice do you give to your children?
Yeah, it's the advice I give to my children, again, it flows from the advice that my father and mother gave me. Every single choice that I make, hundreds of times per day, every time I see another human being, every time I have a conversation with another human being, every time I write something to another human being, every time I'm making a decision about what to do and how to act and what to say, that is a choice that I have to make. I can only control my choices. I can't control yours or anybody else's.
Fabulous.
And so if I handle those with a default to, am I being helpful to myself and to others rather than harmful to myself and others? Those moment by moment by moment by moment choices become habit. Habit becomes discipline, and that turns into character. And that piece of being quote unquote good, again, not in a in a fairy tale kind of way, because God knows I make poor choices on a daily basis. But that essentially is the essence that what President Obama was talking about. And I think that is the beginning. And it has to be the constant work, even at my now advanced age of 51, of every single day. You know, I get to do this all over again. I get to put behind me what happened yesterday. I can't undo it, but can I learn from it to say, you know what, today is going to be a little bit different. That's the essence for me of how I at least try.
Thank you so much. So Alex, they're in the next room at the moment. Imagine them 16, both about to go out. What advice do you give them?
Well, I like your advice, Duncan. I know it's borrowed from others, but be useful and be kind. Simple, clear, in no way patronizing or condescending, I think, and it connects to what it is that makes us human. We are differentiated from most other species by virtue of our empathy for one another. So I think it's a useful motto. What I would just say though is I would kind of flip your invitation, and I would say that we need to have more children giving advice to adults. Children don't have an inbuilt, hardwired desire to discriminate or to hate or to be cynical. Children see wonder and exploration and adventure and learning. And I think the type of leadership that is imbued in the Obama Foundation and that I and we at the Cares family try our best, also absolutely sometimes failing, but try to exemplify, is one that is distributed in its leadership. And I think Gareth Southgate, I always have to get football into any conversation that I have, but he's done this recently. He has showed a new type of empathetic leadership, and there are others around the world, from Marcus Rashford to Naomi Osaka. You know, there are lots of people doing this, but since it's so proximate, the experience of that leadership in this country, at least, what Gareth Southgate did was to listen to his team first and say, what are your values? What do you believe in? What can we achieve together? And how can we demonstrate that togetherness? And so he led from the back, which is a description which doesn't always have the most credence in the world. I know it's one that Barack Obama also used and was somewhat criticized for, but actually it's a very, very valid form of criticism. Of leadership, sorry. It's a very valid form of leadership, and it's listening to the people who are in your community and finding ways for their voices to be heard. And so that's where I would leave it.
And that links to the lovely Nelson Mandela definition of leadership, which is like a shepherd. You let the sheep run on, not realizing they're being led from behind. So I want to say a huge thank you to our guests, David and Alex, and for all they're doing to make it a better world. I want to thank our producer, Hannah Johnson, and to you for listening. Join us next time when we explore ideas of vocation, campaigning, and getting people to give. Till then, be useful and be kind. Thank you.